Hi, I'm Axel with Baramundi Software. Welcome to our session, Remote Work, the Wild West of Endpoint Management. What comes to your mind when thinking of the old Wild West? When I think of the old Wild West, I imagine these wild and dangerous times with outlaws, little western towns, adventures, but also the opportunity it offered. And I know this might be the romanticized version from watching too much western movies, but as the outlaw Henry Starr said shortly before he got shot in a gunfight, I love it. It's wild with adventure. And even I'm sure your users love to work from home, and it was pretty wild and adventurous for you guys to get them there. There are some more similarities. One, for example, just like the old Wild West had to develop where it is nowadays, we had to and still have to adapt and develop our remote working. The last 1.5+ years went by super fast, if you ask me. But yet so much happened in that time. Let's first look in some general developments of remote work. Between 2009 and 2019, the numbers of remote workers were somewhere between 4 to 6%. And that was pretty constant over 10 years. Then in 2020, that number jumped up to 69% pretty much overnight. As you can see, the numbers went down pretty quickly in the first 2 months again, because a lot of companies could implement safe distancing and sanitation stations and stuff, so that some of the users could come back to the offices. But since then, the number is pretty much the same. Also today, we're still at 52% of remote workers over all industries. A McKinsey report said that around 29% of office workers could work remotely, permanently, productively. And the recent Cisco report said that they expect 37% to stay in a remote work situation. And I think that's pretty realistic when we see that we are right now somewhere in the 50s, so 37% doesn't seem too far off. On the in-person events, I like to ask the audience if someone had the chance to move further out because they're working remote now. And usually that number isn't too high when asking IT people. And I think that little comic shows pretty well why that is. Seem familiar? Well, you guys deserve big kudos because you were the ones who kept everything running and made that transition to work remotely even possible. And there was a Harvard Business Review which said that around 22% of the remote workers moved locally or are still planning to. And actually 17% relocated internationally or are still planning to. Around 90% of the big companies are embracing or implemented already a hybrid model for their employees. Just like Baramundi, they ask us to come to the office for 3 days in the week and 2 days can be work from home now. Then of course we had some extremes like Twitter, for example. They announced pretty early already that they don't ask the users to come back at all. And that big outdoor apparel store REI, they built a whole new headquarter up in Bellevue, Washington, never even moved in because they said, we stay remote now. Let's look into a more IT approach of things. What happened in the IT world in the meantime? Well, first of all, you had to get your users ready to work from home. So you had to provide new devices, maybe mobile devices. You had to train them and everything, provide applications and such. And after all these companies and schools moved into homeschooling and working remotely, that created an extraordinary demand on tech gear. And even today we can tell with the chip shortage that a lot of stuff is not available when we need it. And even the production issues are expected to be resolved by end of this year, it will probably affect the delivery and pricing until at least end of next year. Then on the software side, we had over 22 patches just for the Adobe Acrobat DC and Reader since the beginning of the pandemic. That's more than 1 patch per month of an application probably everyone out there has in use. And after you probably don't just have one application on those machines, there are quite a few patches you had to keep track of. And if it's not the third-party stuff, well, then you have the Microsoft patches you have to keep track of. And not just the Microsoft patches, Microsoft also releases in-place upgrades on a regular basis, which you have to keep track of as well. And that have been 4 since the beginning of the pandemic. You probably used a 1909 version on most of the machines when you sent them home, which is already out of service. So in the meantime, you had to make sure to bring those machines on a newer version, which was probably a big challenge even if you had some good deployment and imaging tools. Then this December, the 2004 version will be the next in line to be out of service. And something between October and mid of next year, we can expect even a new operating system, Windows 11. Cyber attacks are 4 times higher compared to before the pandemic. And even that was big in the news 1 month into the pandemic, that number hasn't changed. Latest research showed that the number right now is estimated around 3.5 times higher compared to before the pandemic. But on the phishing side, that's even 6 times higher. There was a study which was conducted in Asia which showed that the same users which ignored a phishing email in an office environment were much more likely to open phishing emails in a home office environment. And that's because we have some whole new challenges and the attackers have it so much easier now. You can imagine your offices being like old Western towns. You had your localized law, like you had your firewalls and package inspectors and stuff. The old Western towns had their sheriff and their madams, which pretty much exactly knew what was going on in their town. And then your endpoints just left that safe town. In the offices, we had a natural defense mechanism where our users could just communicate to each other and maybe ask someone for help if they were not sure if an email might be phishing or something. And studies showed that it doesn't replicate when the users are working from home anymore. Even if you have good communication tools like Teams, for example, and especially if not. And scammers and hackers know about this. Just like the outlaws didn't necessarily target people and banks in the town, they went for the money transports, for the travelers and the camps out there, which are much easier to reach. Then the endpoints are in the home user's network now. That also means they inherited the security risks of a home network. And as said, they don't have the short communication way anymore. That means also reporting something is a much higher effort, which is not taken necessarily anymore. Then we have some challenges like, where's my user actually working? Are they working from home? Are they working from the local coffee saloon? Do they have a fast enough internet connection? Who else is in the same network? Or maybe even using the same endpoints like them when they have kids in homeschooling? And I think we all agree if the user is working from a public Wi-Fi, they should use a VPN connection. But is the user using the VPN connection? Do they need it for their daily work? So what are some things we can actually do now? Well, first of all, when you had stopgap solutions in the beginning, you have to recalibrate your IT and processes to the new way of working. Depending on what scenario applies for you, a hybrid scenario or fully remote scenario, you have different ways of working here. If the machines are always remote, you want to find solutions which are available through the internet and not dependent on any network connectivity. Even if the user has VPN connection, doesn't really mean that they always will connect through the VPN and that you can actually reach that endpoint. With hybrid, you have a few more options. So there you can schedule things differently. You still want to make sure that you can patch machines when they're outside of the network, because you don't want unpatched or infected machines coming into your network on a regular basis. But on the other hand, whenever they are back in the office, you can do all the stuff which is big and bulky, like in-place upgrades or bigger application updates. And maybe you can even utilize tools like Wake on LAN, because the user leaves the machine overnight when they're there for a couple of days. If you worked with a WSUS before, you probably realized pretty quickly that this is not the right tool to manage and patch endpoints outside the network. Ask the users to patch the machines themselves? Also not the best way. Here it's really important that you find a patching solutions which fit your requirements. If your endpoints are always outside the network, you can get a tool which just relies on internet sources and not on any network connectivity. But if your endpoints are coming back on a regular basis, you want a tool which can also utilize a repository in the network so the endpoint doesn't have to download everything from the internet sources whenever they are in the office. And patch management really shouldn't be a topic of remote work. Pretty much every ransomware attack which made the news started with a missing patch on some machine out there. To not have a patching solution is a little bit like running with scissors. It's just a matter of time before something messy happens. From the smartphone and tablet world, we're used to just wipe devices whenever they get lost or stolen. That's something which doesn't replicate really good on Windows devices. So here the best way is usually to encrypt those devices, so in case they get lost or stolen, whoever has that device then can't access any sensitive company data. And you're not dependent on any internet connectivity to make sure that no one can access that. And with BitLocker being part of the professional and enterprise licensing, that shouldn't be a question of budget neither. And then, of course, our biggest security risk is the user. But you can't blame them. They're not all techies and know everything about IT security. So it's really important that you make your users understand the basics out there. And I collected some information under that QR code, feel free to scan that, with some ideas of how to explain your users IT security in a remote world. And some points are, for example, that if possible, the user should own the devices. Because with the rented devices from the ISPs, there's just another security risk with the ISPs storing all the data and logins and stuff in their network again. And at least if you can't enforce that, make sure that the user changes their standard settings to deactivate the shared Wi-Fis they usually provide. And of course, change the default password as an absolutely minimum. Then the users should avoid public Wi-Fis. You can just explain them, public Wi-Fis are like STDs. It's something to avoid and to protect from. And if they really have to connect to public Wi-Fis because they just prefer to work from the local coffee saloon, then at least utilize the VPN clients and make sure that they actually connect. And then last but not least, if the user has something which seems suspicious or they get an email where they're not sure about, report it. And I know most of the companies out there ask the users to do that, but I think it's really important that you make your users comfortable to report. Because if the user makes a mistake, they might try to hide that. So it's really important to make them comfortable that mistakes happen, and it's more important to report that in that case so that the IT department can get active before it gets too bad. To round this up, there is of course not the one right way to protect your endpoints in a remote work environment. But if you can manage to recalibrate your IT to adapt to the new situation with a minimum of keeping the machines up to date, encrypt sensitive data, and make sure the users get the basic of some IT security awareness, then you're definitely on the right trail to survive in the wild remote work world. And to close that with misquoting Butch Cassidy, well, if there ain't gonna be any rules, let's get this started.